My father was a man who fundamentally believed that the loudest person in the room was usually the weakest, and the flashiest person was almost always the most broke. He worked as an independent commercial plumber for 45 years. He was a massive, quiet man with hands that felt like rough sandpaper. He drove a beat-up, rusty 1998 Ford F-150 that rattled violently when it hit 50 miles per hour, and always smelled faintly of copper pipes, black coffee, and old leather. He wore heavy steel-toed boots that were perpetually covered in a fine layer of gray drywall dust, and he bought his flannel shirts in bulk from discount warehouse stores. To anyone looking at him from the outside, the cashiers at the grocery store, the tellers at the local bank, the neighbors in our modest, working-class suburb, he was just a hard-working, exhausted blue-collar guy trying to scrape by and make ends meet until retirement. But my father had a brilliant, quiet, and ruthlessly disciplined financial mind. He didn't care about looking rich, he cared about actually being wealthy. Every time he made a profit on a major commercial contracting job, he didn't buy a fancy gold watch, a luxury car, or a boat to show off to the neighbors on the weekends. He bought commercial real estate. He bought empty, overgrown lots on the outskirts of the city. He bought low-yield, run-down apartment buildings and abandoned strip malls in neighborhoods that his incredibly sharp instincts told him were just a decade away from gentrifying. Over 4 decades of bleeding, sweating, and aggressively saving every spare penny, he quietly, methodically built an absolute financial empire while flying entirely under the radar of everyone who knew him. He taught me everything there was to know about the philosophy of stealth wealth. He taught me that money is not meant to be worn on your wrist or parked in your driveway to seek the validation of strangers who don't actually care about you. It is meant to buy absolute freedom, impenetrable security, and the ultimate peace of mind. I remember sitting with him at a cheap, all-night diner when I was 16 years old. A man walked in wearing a tailored designer suit, shouting aggressively into a cell phone, tossing the keys to a brand new BMW onto the diner counter so everyone could see them. My dad watched him for a moment, took a slow sip of his black coffee, and quietly said to me, "Clara, the moment you show people what you have, they stop seeing you as a human being and start seeing you as a bank. Rich is a loud shout, wealth is a quiet whisper. True power doesn't ever need to announce itself." When I was 28, my father passed away quietly in his sleep from a sudden, undetected heart condition. It was the darkest, most devastating period of my entire life. I didn't just lose a parent, I lost my mentor, my best friend, and my moral compass. His funeral was modest, attended mostly by other tradesmen, plumbers, electricians, and people whose lives he had secretly helped fund over the years without ever asking for recognition. A week after we buried him, I received a formal letter requesting my presence at the offices of Rothschild Thorne, a top-tier, ultra-exclusive wealth management and legal firm located in the penthouse of a glass skyscraper in the financial district. I arrived in my sensible work clothes, feeling entirely out of place among the marble floors and original artwork. I was escorted into a polished, glass-walled conference room to meet with the senior managing partner, an older gentleman named Mr. Abernathy, to read my father's final will and testament. My father, ever the forward thinker, had quietly liquidated his massive real estate portfolio a year before he died. He had sensed his health was failing, though he never told me, and he wanted to make the financial transition completely seamless, so I wouldn't have to deal with managing properties while grieving. He left me absolutely everything. Mr. Abernathy offered me a glass of water, gave his condolences, and then slid a heavy, gold-embossed leather folder across the mahogany table. I opened it, scanning the dense legal jargon until my eyes found the bottom line. I stopped breathing. I was suddenly, overnight, the sole beneficiary of a perfectly structured, ironclad, tax-protected trust fund containing exactly 15,482,604.12. I sat in that chair for an hour, just staring at the number. I didn't quit my job as a mid-level marketing manager at a local tech firm. I didn't run out and buy a sprawling mansion in the hills. I didn't trade in my highly reliable 7-year-old Honda Civic. I kept my profound grief private, and I kept my staggering wealth a total, absolute secret from the world. I placed the money into a high-yield, deeply diversified portfolio managed by Mr. Abernathy and his team of elite fiduciaries. I lived strictly off my own modest marketing salary, letting the 15 million sit and quietly generate massive amounts of compound interest every single month. I wanted to build my own life. Most importantly, remembering my father's warning at the diner all those years ago, I wanted to be loved for exactly who I was, not for what my bank account held. 2 years later, I met Mark. Mark and I met at a charity gala my marketing firm was organizing. He was incredibly handsome, charming, and seemed to be fiercely driven. He worked in luxury commercial real estate sales, constantly hustling and chasing massive commissions. In the beginning, he seemed to share my intense work ethic. He was attentive, sweet, and we fell in love quickly. But when things got serious and I finally met his family, specifically his mama as Victoria, the red flags didn't just wave, they snapped violently in the wind. Victoria was the exact terrifying opposite of my late father. She was what the ruthless financial world calls a $30,000 millionaire. She leased a brand new, top-of-the-line Mercedes SUV every 2 years, wore head-to-toe, heavily branded designer clothing with the logos plastered everywhere so you knew exactly how much she spent, and constantly name-dropped exclusive restaurants, local politicians, and country clubs she could barely afford to step inside. But it was all a meticulously constructed, incredibly fragile facade built on a terrifying, teetering mountain of high-interest credit card debt, personal loans, and heavily leveraged home equity. Her house was massive on the outside, but half the rooms were completely empty because she couldn't afford furniture. Victoria was a vicious, unyielding social climber who evaluated human worth entirely by price tags, zip codes, and perceived status. From the very first moment we met at a pretentious country club luncheon she had forced Mark to pay for, she looked down on me with poorly concealed, visceral disgust. She would sneer openly at my unbranded, comfortable clothes, asking with a fake, sweet smile if I had found my sweater at a local thrift shop. She would make passive-aggressive, biting comments about my Honda Civic parked in her pristine driveway, loudly asking Mark if my little junker was leaking oil on her imported Italian pavers. She frequently asked Mark, loud enough for me to hear from the kitchen, why a man of his immense caliber and potential couldn't find a woman with proper pedigree, ambition, and a respectable family background. Mark, who was deeply enmeshed with his mother and absolutely terrified of her disapproval, would just shrug, look away, and tell me to ignore her because that's just how she is. She just wants the best for me, Clara. Don't take it personally. I loved him, and I foolishly believed my love could eventually separate him from her toxicity and show him a better way to live, so I swallowed my pride. I tolerated her immense cruelty, smiling politely through gritted teeth, staying entirely silent about the multi-million-dollar safety net I sat on. When Mark and I got married, in a small, quiet, intimate, botanical garden ceremony that Victoria complained bitterly about to anyone who would listen because it wasn't a lavish spectacle she could show off to her friends, we started looking for a house. The dynamic instantly became a vicious battleground. Mark, fueled entirely by his mother's endless, whispering demands in his ear, wanted to stretch our combined salaries to the absolute, terrifying breaking point. He wanted to take out a massive mortgage we couldn't afford to buy a massive, ostentatious, poorly built McMansion in a heavily gated community, just to impress Victoria's social circle. I flatly refused to live house poor, drowning in monthly payments just for social media photos and his mother's bragging rights. I told him I would not be a slave to a mortgage. Instead, using a blind LLC established by my wealth management team to ensure total legal anonymity. I named the LLC Dusty Boots Holdings in honor of my dad. I purchased a beautiful, historic, 4-bedroom craftsman home in a quiet, leafy, established neighborhood lined with ancient oak trees. I bought the house outright in cash for just over $1.2 million. I told Mark that I had scoured the local listings and found a private, incredibly wealthy, highly eccentric landlord who was moving to Europe for work. I told him this landlord was willing to rent the speculator house to us for a phenomenally low monthly price, on the strict condition that we maintained it perfectly and never bothered him with minor issues. Mark, entirely oblivious to how legal real estate paperwork actually functioned and thrilled by the incredibly low monthly payment that freed up his cash for leased cars and expensive watches, eagerly agreed without looking into it. Every single month, Mark transferred his half of the rent to a checking account I managed. What he didn't know was that I was taking every single penny of his rent money and putting it directly into a high-yield savings account, exclusively for our future. I was secretly building a massive nest egg for us, completely rent-free, protecting him from his own terrible spending habits and his mother's constant, suffocating pressure to buy luxury items. Victoria, however, was absolutely furious about our living situation. She utterly despised the fact that her son was renting like a common working-class peasant instead of owning a luxury estate with Roman columns and a fountain. She blamed me entirely for holding him back in life. She started actively, maliciously telling the extended family that I was dragging Mark down, that I was a financial parasite, and that I lacked the intelligence, drive, and sophistication to build real wealth. The situation escalated drastically and dangerously about a year and a half into our marriage. My wealth management firm underwent a massive corporate restructuring, and they sent me several thick, intimidating legal envelopes via certified mail to update my trust fund documents, sign new fiduciary agreements, and verify offshore tax designations. The return address on the heavy, watermarked envelopes proudly displayed the name Rothschild and Thorne. One afternoon, Victoria let herself into our house using a spare key she had relentlessly demanded from Mark for emergencies. I was at the office, and Mark was in his home office with the door closed on a long Zoom call. Victoria unapologetically snooped through the mail I had left sorted on the kitchen island. She saw these thick, terrifying-looking legal envelopes addressed specifically to me. Victoria, combining her extreme arrogance with profound, staggering ignorance, immediately pulled out her phone and Googled the law firm. Seeing the bold text on their website that they handled massive financial restructuring, asset liquidation, and high-level corporate debt, her malicious, deeply paranoid mind jumped to the wildest, most vindictive possible conclusion. She didn't read the second paragraph, the part where they proudly advertised handling billion-dollar trusts for the elite 1%. She only saw the words debt and liquidation. She immediately assumed that I was drowning in a catastrophic amount of secret, crippling financial ruin. She convinced herself that my modest clothes, my lack of designer bags, and my absolute refusal to buy a new car weren't practical lifestyle choices. They were the desperate, pathetic results of me being completely broke and facing imminent ruinous personal bankruptcy. Victoria didn't ask me about it. She didn't confront me privately to express concern, as a normal, loving mother-in-law might. She went straight to Mark's home office, shut the door, and poured pure, unadulterated poison into his ear. She told him that I was a massive scam artist hiding hundreds of thousands of dollars in secret, toxic debt. She convinced him that the heavy legal letters were from aggressive debt collectors, preparing to seize his assets, garnish his real estate commissions, and ruin his pristine credit score. She told him I was a gold digger secretly destroying his entire financial future from the inside out. Mark, who always defaulted to believing his mother over anyone else in the world, completely panicked. Instead of talking to his own wife, instead of asking me a single simple question about the mail, he let his mother orchestrate a devastating, public ambush designed to break me. The ultimate betrayal happened on Thanksgiving Day. Victoria had aggressively insisted on hosting dinner at our rented house, inviting Mark's entire extended family. 3 aunts, 2 uncles, and a half-dozen cousins who all shared her pretentious, deeply toxic worldview. The dinner was incredibly tense from the moment they walked through the front door. Throughout the meal, Victoria kept making snide, heavily loaded comments about financial responsibility, the extreme dangers of hidden secrets, and the paramount importance of total transparency in a marriage. I stayed quiet, pouring wine, carving the turkey, and helping to serve the food, assuming she was just being her usual terrible, overbearing self and trying to ruin the holiday. After the dessert plates were cleared and the coffee was poured, the trap was officially sprung. Victoria stood up at the head of my dining room table. She tapped her crystal wine glass with a silver spoon to demand absolute, breathless silence from the 20 people in the room. She reached down into her designer tote bag and picked up a thick manila folder she had hidden near her chair. "Family," Victoria announced, her voice dripping with fake, theatrical, sickening sorrow. She placed a hand dramatically over her heart. "I am so deeply sorry to ruin a beautiful holiday gathering. But as a mother, I must protect my son at all costs, even if it breaks my heart. We are here today to stage a financial intervention. Mark has been completely blinded and manipulated by a woman who is systematically destroying his life and his future." I froze, the heavy ceramic coffee pot still in my hand, and looked sharply at Mark. He wouldn't make eye contact with me. He was staring intensely at his linen napkin, his face flushed bright red, his jaw tight. He looked terrified and angry all at once. Victoria pulled out blown-up, color photocopies she had secretly made of the envelopes from my wealth management firm. She threw them onto the center of the table like undeniable, smoking gun evidence in a murder trial. "Clara," Victoria said, pointing a manicured, shaking finger directly at my face, her voice rising to a triumphant, hysterical shout that echoed off the dining room walls. "You have been lying to my son since the day you manipulated your way into his life. We know about the law firms. We know about the financial restructuring. We know that your pathetic, cheap, drab little lifestyle is just a desperate cover for the fact that you are drowning in massive, insurmountable debt. You are a parasite. You are bankrupting my son to pay off your secret loans and your bad decisions." The entire extended family actually gasped. The room erupted into shocked, horrified whispers. An aunt covered her mouth in sheer scandal. An uncle shook his head in disgust. I slowly, deliberately set the coffee pot down on a cork trivet. I looked at my husband, the man I had vowed to spend the rest of my life with, the man I was secretly building a fortune for. "Mark," I asked quietly, my voice betraying my profound, shattering heartbreak, "did you know she was going to do this today? Do you actually believe this insane theory?" Mark finally looked up, his expression a pathetic mixture of cowardice, anger, and embarrassment. "My mother showed me the proof, Clara," he said defensively, his voice cracking slightly. "You're hiding massive financial and legal problems from me. You're putting my credit score and my real estate career at risk. I can't be tied to a sinking ship. You lied to me about who you are." Victoria wasn't done playing the executioner. She pulled a terrifyingly thick, bound legal document from her folder and slapped it onto the wood table with a loud, aggressive thud. "This is a post-nuptial agreement," she declared proudly, puffing out her chest, looking at me as if she had just won a war and conquered a nation. "My personal lawyers drafted it yesterday on an emergency basis. It completely separates Mark from your toxic debts, gives him total, exclusive control over his own income, and requires you to vacate this rented house immediately if you default on your hidden loans. You are going to sign it right now, with this pen, in front of everyone in this room as witnesses, or Mark is filing for divorce tomorrow morning." They'd planned this meticulously. They had invited an audience to maximize my humiliation, hoping the shock, the brutal ambuscade, and the overwhelming public shame would bully me into tears, force me into signing away my marital rights and confessing to a lie that didn't even exist. They thought they had cornered a frightened, broke, desperate mouse who would fold under the pressure of their perceived wealth and status. They had absolutely no idea they had just locked themselves in a cage with a tiger. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't defend myself immediately. Years of observing my father negotiate vicious, multi-million-dollar commercial real estate deals with ruthless, cutthroat men had taught me the devastating, paralyzing power of absolute silence. When you know you hold all the cards, you let the other side exhaust themselves. I stood up slowly from the table. The room went dead quiet. the tension so thick it felt hard to breathe. I walked over to the antique credenza in the corner of the dining room. I unlocked the bottom drawer, opened my leatherwork briefcase, and I pulled out my own thick, heavy, fireproof document folder. I walked back and stood directly across the table from Victoria. I didn't raise my voice a single decibel. I spoke in a register so calm it was almost robotic, but this icy, clinical, absolute authority in my tone made the entire room physically flinch. "Victoria," I said calmly, maintaining unbroken eye contact with her, "since you are so incredibly fond of committing federal felonies by opening and reading my personal mail, it's a profound shame you didn't have the intellectual capacity or the legal authority to actually read the contents inside those envelopes. If you had, you would have saved your son's marriage today." I opened my leather folder. I pulled out the first document, a certified, notarized, heavily stamped property deed from the county clerk's office, and slid it across the polished wood table directly in front of Mark. "First of all, Mark," I said, looking at my husband's confused, rapidly paling face, "we don't have a landlord. I am the landlord. I bought this historic house in cash 2 months before we got married through a blind LLC named Dusty Boots Holdings. You aren't paying rent. You've been paying into a joint savings account that I secretly set up to build a secure future for us, because you spend your commission checks as fast as you make them trying to impress your mother and her friends. I was trying to protect you, but since you just tried to legally force me out of my own property with a sham postnuptial agreement, you can consider your tenancy officially terminated." Mark's jaw physically dropped open. He stared at the deed, seeing my LLC listed as the sole proprietor, completely paralyzed by the shock of the revelation. His hands started to shake as he realized what he had just done. I turned my dead-eyed gaze back to Victoria, who was suddenly looking incredibly pale, the triumphant, vicious smirk completely melting off her face, replaced by a dawning horror. I pulled out the second document, a heavily redacted but indisputable summary of my trust fund portfolio on the official, watermarked gold letterhead of the law firm she had Googled. I dropped it directly on top of her ridiculous, threatening postnuptial agreement. "Secondly, Victoria," I continued, my voice dripping with surgical precision, "that law firm does not handle debt collection. They handle elite, high-net-worth wealth management, offshore accounts, and trust fund restructuring for the 1%. The letters you snooped on were simply quarterly tax documents for my investment portfolio." I leaned in closer to her, resting my hands firmly on the table, lowering my voice so the absolute devastation of my words would hit her with maximum impact. "I am not in debt, Victoria. When my father died, he left me a liquid trust fund of $15 million. The absolute deafening silence in the dining room was like a physical weight crushing the air out of the room. You could have heard a heartbeat. Victoria's mouth was opening and closing like a suffocating fish on a dock. Her entire reality, her entire false sense of superiority, her entire identity as the wealthiest, most important person in the room had just been vaporized in less than 60 seconds. The poor, trashy, unrefined girl she had spent years relentlessly bullying was a multi-millionaire who literally owned the very ground she was standing on. Mark stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. His face was completely drained of blood, sheer, unadulterated panic flooding his eyes. "Clara, 15 million. You own the house? I didn't know. My mother told me. She said she was sure you were scamming me." "You chose to believe your mother," I cut him off, my voice sharp and unforgiving as broken glass. "You chose to humiliate your own wife in front of an audience instead of having a basic, adult conversation with me. You chose to ambush me with legal documents to protect your precious, leased lifestyle. You failed the only test that mattered." I picked up Victoria's postnuptial agreement, ripped it cleanly in half right down the middle, and let the pieces flutter to the floor like the absolute trash it was. "I won't be signing this," I said quietly, looking directly into Mark's terrified, tear-filled eyes. "But you can absolutely expect a call from my lawyers on Monday morning. Given that the 15 million is inherited wealth, kept completely separate in an ironclad trust, and the house was purchased prior to the marriage using those exact funds. You are legally entitled to absolutely nothing in the divorce, Mark. Not one single dime. You get to leave with exactly what you brought into this marriage. I turned to the extended family, who were all sitting frozen in their chairs, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes, completely realizing they were sitting in a multi-millionaire's home after actively participating in insulting and ambushing the host. "Dinner is over," I announced clearly, gesturing to the front door. "Get out of my house." The scramble that followed was pathetic to watch. Victoria tried to stutter out an apology, her arrogant demeanor entirely broken, suddenly terrified of the massive wealth and legal power she had just insulted. She tried to reach for my hand, stammering about a misunderstanding, but I simply pointed toward the front door, refusing to speak another word to her. Mark tried to grab my arm to beg, tears spilling down his cheeks, pleading that we could talk about this privately, that he loved me, but the look of pure, unadulterated disgust I gave him stopped him dead in his tracks. They packed up their coats in absolute, humiliating silence and practically ran out the front door into the cold November night, leaving their half-eaten turkey on the table. The divorce was swift, brutal, and entirely one-sided. Once Mark realized the sheer magnitude of what he had lost, he became desperate. He called me hundreds of times, sent expensive flowers, and even showed up at my office begging for forgiveness, crying that his mother had brainwashed him, and he had made a terrible mistake. I never responded to a single message. His lawyers tried desperately to fight for a piece of the house or spousal support, but my legal team, the very firm Victoria had been so terrified of, crushed them effortlessly in court. Because of his mother's intervention, his own staggering cowardice, and the airtight nature of my trust, Mark walked away from the marriage with exactly what he brought into it. Nothing but a leased car, credit card debt, and a wardrobe of tight suits. Victoria's reputation in their social circle was completely ruined. The extended family, having witnessed the spectacular, humiliating backfire of her Thanksgiving ambush, gossiped about it relentlessly. They told everyone at the country club how Victoria had essentially bullied a multi-millionaire out of her son's life due to her own paranoia and greed. Her fake, pretentious empire finally crumbled under the weight of reality, with Mark no longer able to secretly bail her out using his real estate commissions, which dried up significantly due to his severe depression over the divorce. Victoria was forced to surrender her leased Mercedes back to the dealership. Last I heard, she was forced to downsize to a small, cramped apartment on the bad side of town because she couldn't keep up with her credit card minimums. I stayed in my beautiful, paid-off historic house. I kept driving my reliable Honda Civic. I kept living my quiet, peaceful, incredibly secure life. Every time I sit in my garden, drinking coffee and looking at the ancient oak trees my father's hard-earned money bought, I think of him and smile. He was absolutely right. You never need to be the loudest person in the room. You just need to be the smartest,